go. Okay, right. So we've covered biological diversity with all the time that we can give it. I've talked about different types of archaea, bacteria, animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And what I wanted to leave you with is the idea that all of this biodiversity has a history, and you can't fully understand it without understanding something about its history. Just like you can't understand the United States in the year 2022 without understanding our history. You know, everything from, the history of the labor movement, the history of slavery and race relations, the history of the Cold War, the history of our relations with, Russia and Eastern Europe. All of those things you need to know something about if you want to have any hope of making sense of what's on the news these days. History plays out today for better or for worse. And that's just as true for the living world. The consequences of that history are still with us. And this may leave you wondering where that history all comes from. Okay, checking the chat to see if there's anything I need to answer. And so I want to start talking about where that history comes from. I am going to go into human history a bit and talk about some dead white dudes. Again, what's most important here is not the details of their lives. What is most important here is the ideas that they had. And I teach this way because I want you to see that scientific ideas do not just simply drop out of the sky or, get handed down on Mount Sinai or anything like that. Scientific ideas have a history. People come up with them. They have reasons for it. They argue them and debate them and discuss them and change them. It's a very human thing to do. And so I'll start with 1831 with this guy, Captain Robert Fitzroy. He is captain in the British Navy. He's come back from a surveying trip to South America because the British Navy then, just like any Navy, needs to have very accurate maps and charts of any part of the ocean where they might want to go. There had been several cases in the past of British naval ships wrecking and drowning everybody because they'd run into rocks that weren't marked on the maps or were marked in the wrong place, so they didn't know to avoid them. That happened often enough that the Navy was doing this global mapping project, and Captain Fitzroy of Her Majesty's ship Beagle, not a very big ship, only about 100 feet long and only capable of packing 10 guns. When he's getting ready to go out on the second of his surveying voyages to South America to map the coastline. And he had a crew, he had specialists, and he was looking for someone who could describe and study the animals and plants and rocks. There weren't many jobs at the time for what we'd call professional scientists, but there were certainly knowledgeable people. And he asked around for somebody who could make his description of South America more complete and maybe find out information the Navy might need to know, like where can we find tall trees if we have to rebuild part of a ship? Or where can we find animals to shoot if we're shipwrecked and need to survive for a while? Things like that. So he asked around, and he asked a friend of his who was a professor at Cambridge University, and the friend wanted to go himself, but his wife wouldn't let him. So his friend said, hey, I know that this guy who just graduated from one of my classes. He's really smart. He knows a lot about biology. He has studied geology as well, gone out and looked at rocks. He's very easy to get along with, which is important because on a small sailing ship, you can't help but be in everybody else's face. And in tight quarters like that, under difficult conditions for weeks on end, you've got to be able to get along with people. And this gent was easy to get along with. He knew his stuff. He was actually preparing for a career as a minister. He'd gotten a degree in theology, the study of religion, the study of Christianity in this case. He would have been a minister in the Anglican Church. If you don't know, the American branch of the Anglican Communion is the Episcopal Church. But he leaped at the chance to sail, as it turned out, around the world. And his dad was rich enough that his dad could pay his costs. Who wouldn't want to go on a nice, round the world cruise? So Her Majesty's ship Beagle left England a couple of days after Christmas in 1831 with our young hero, Charles Darwin, on board. And they reached South America early in 1832, starting at Brazil. And they spent the next 3 years surveying the Atlantic coast of South America, going all the way down to what's now Argentina and back and out and back, zigzagging up this way. They would end up, by the way, going around the tip of South America. They actually found a new passage that's to this day called the Beagle Channel, that was a relatively protected way to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific by rounding the southern tip of South America. The charts that they made, by the way, were still in use until recently, now that we have better mapping by satellites. But until the space age, the charts that they made were still in use. Fitzroy did his job really well. And Charles Darwin, or as I like to call him, Chuck D, had time and money to leave the ship and go inland. So he got to explore the Brazilian rainforest. He dug up fossils and shipped them back to Great Britain for later study. He shot animals and birds and collected their skins and collected plants and things like that, made lots and lots of notes, visited cities, visited with those people in the little boat right there are the southernmost of all Native Americans. They're called the Yamana people, living at the southernmost tip of South America. And we don't have time to go into all of it. If you really want to know, his edited diary is now published under the title Voyage of the Beagle, and you can find it online if anybody's curious. If you like voyages of, life in a sailing ship. But I'm going to focus for our purposes on just one brief episode out of 5 years at sea. After exploring South America, the Beagle sailed up the west coast and then crossed the Pacific and ended up stopping in Australia, crossing the Indian Ocean, going around the tip of South Africa, crossing the Atlantic, stopping in Brazil one more time, and then coming back to England. And they stopped for food and water on the return voyage in a small cluster of rocky islands 600 miles off the coast of what's now Ecuador. The islands located right on the equator, and they're called the Galapagos Islands. This is a fairly typical view of the Galapagos. They're quite dry. Much of the vegetation is actually desert. They're on the equator, but these are not tropical islands with lots of sandy beaches, palm trees, and people bringing you rum drinks with paper umbrellas in them. The Galapagos are pretty harsh. They're also made of lava rock. They are, in fact, volcanoes, and there was a sizable eruption on one of the islands a month ago, January 7th, 2022. There are usually, there was another eruption in 2020, and yeah, every couple of years, one of those volcanoes goes boom. Even where the volcanoes are not currently active, you can see, as this picture shows, congealed lava flows. That stuff that has this ribbony, ropey look to it, like hot fudge poured into a cold pan. That's what solidified lava can look like. That's the remains of a volcanic eruption. Relatively speaking, think about this. They're small. They're still erupting. There hasn't been a huge amount of time for those islands to build. So they are, relatively speaking, much younger than the mainland of South America. We can kind of confirm this by looking at some of the fossils, which we talked about on Monday. And here was where Darwin got interested. There is wildlife on the Galapagos, much of it endangered today, unfortunately, but much of it very distinctive. For example, that's a Galapagos hawk, and it's in the same genus Buteo, as birds that are familiar around here, birds that you could see around here, like the red-tailed hawk. Red-tailed hawks are Buteo jamaicensis. A few years ago, there was actually a pair of them nesting in a tree about a block from campus. So we get them around here. And the Galapagos hawk is in the same genus, Buteo jamaicensis, but it's still different enough that we call it a separate species. And as far as I know, it can't interbreed with other hawks in the genus Buteo. So it's a separate species. It's found in the Galapagos, and it's found only in the Galapagos, nowhere else in the world. The same is true for, these guys. The Galapagos have penguins. They're the only penguins found in the northern hemisphere because they might occasionally get maybe 1 mile north of the equator. Like I said, the Galapagos are right on the equator. It's similar to penguins that you'd find farther south in South America on the coast of Chile, but it's still not the same as South American penguins. And the only place in the world you find Spheniscus mendiculus is, in fact, the Galapagos. Nowhere else in the world. This was true for the Galapagos iguanas. There are 2 species of iguanas that are not found anywhere else but the Galapagos. Very odd animals. Galapagos iguanas will sit on rocky beaches, soak up the sun until they're nice and warm, and then jump in the water and swim around and eat seaweed, which is kind of a weird thing for a lizard to do. And they're similar to South American iguanas. South America is where they're native to, but they're still not the same. And you find this pattern all over the place. There are 3 or 4 species of mockingbird that are found only in the Galapagos, nowhere else in the world. There are prickly pear cactus that are found only in the Galapagos. There are giant land tortoises that are, they look like little turtles, except they're big enough that in theory you could ride one. Darwin actually tried sitting on the back of one of them. He found out that he didn't get very far because the tortoise just kind of kept on looking at him and going, so yeah, you can't really ride the tortoises, but they're big enough that a full-grown person could sit on one. And they are only found in the Galapagos as well. There's a tomato plant, a wild tomato that's found only in the Galapagos. This happens all the time. Probably the most famous Galapagos life forms are the Galapagos finches. Now, finches are a group of seed-eating birds, and the finch that you know the best is probably the cardinal. Cardinals are finches. If you've ever done bird watching, you might have spotted purple finches around here too. There are several ones in Arkansas. There's 14 species of finches in the Galapagos Islands. And this is one of them. This is the small ground finch, Geospiza fuliginosa. Geospiza fuliginosa. Okay, the automatic transcriber had trouble with that. Now, here's the thing. First of all, not all 14 species live together on the same islands. You have different species that live on different islands. There is some overlap among them. So each species might inhabit several of the islands, but no species lives everywhere. So that's interesting. What's more, each species has a distinctive way of life. And each one shows what we call adaptations to that way of life. On the right, that's the large ground finch, Geospiza magna-rostris. Finches commonly eat seeds. Geospiza magna-rostris eats large seeds, and it's got a very large and very powerful bill that can exert a lot of muscular force needed to crack larger seeds. The one you saw earlier, Geospiza fuliginosa, small bill, can't crack big seeds, but it can pick up and handle small seeds that the large beak ground finch is too clumsy to handle. And then the one on the left, the cactus finch right here, Geospiza scandens, long and narrow beak. That one spends a lot of time foraging on cactus, and it will feed on cactus seeds, cactus fruits, cactus flowers. And as you might expect for a bird that spends a lot of time on very spiky plants, it's got a long and narrow beak, a little bit more like a pair of needle nose pliers. Whereas the large ground finch has something more like linesman's pliers that's much blunter and can exert more force, but can't handle delicate jobs. So we not only have different species, each species has a different way of life, a different diet, a different habitat, and each one physically shows what we call adaptations. Each one is capable of doing different things, and each one has physical traits, physical features that enable it to do that. For the record, no, you do not have to memorize any scientific names. You do not have to remember Geospiza fuliginosa. The question just came up, are these birds going to be on the test? Here's what I usually do. You don't have to memorize details of the case studies that I give you, but you do have to learn the principles behind them. I might not ask you any questions about Galapagos finches. I might ask you a question about, I might ask you a question about cichlid fish in the East African Rift Valley lakes. And you're probably going, huh? Why would he ask a question about that? Those also are great examples of adaptation, and they're an example of what we call a species flock. They show the same principles as the Galapagos finches do. And so I might ask you a question about something you've never seen before, but if you know the principles, you'll be able to apply them, because that's the real test of knowing something, is being able to take that knowledge and apply it to a situation that's not familiar. So I'm not going to ask you detailed questions about finches. I mean, unless you want to become a bird specialist, in which case you ought to talk with Dr. McDonald on our faculty. But I am going to ask you questions about adaptation. I'm going to ask you questions about the process of speciation, which we'll talk about more coming up. Okay, hopefully I answered that and didn't scare anybody too badly. Okay, just checking the chat. Okay, thumbs up, great. Okay, so these are all finches. They all share a common structure. They are physically very similar to each other in most regards, and yet they have these different adaptations to the different lifestyles that they lead and the different diets that they have, reflected most obviously in size and shape of the beak. And that raises the question, what are they doing there? Why should there be 14 unique species of finch found only in the Galapagos Islands and nowhere else in the world? Why should there be finches that have great big seed cracking beaks like a parrot, but then not have any parrots? Why did nobody just put parrots in the Galapagos? Why are there finches that live like parrots, but not actual parrots? You know, what's going on here? Why do we have this diversity where we find it? And like the other critters that I mentioned, the Galapagos finches look like species that you'd find in mainland South America. Specifically, they look like a group of South American finches whose common name is the grassquits. This is one of them, Tiaris bicolor. So the Galapagos finches are similar to South American grassquit finches, and yet they're not the same, they're not identical, and they're only found in the Galapagos, nowhere else in the world. Why? Well, Chuck D speculated as the beagle left the Galapagos and crossed the Pacific and headed for Tahiti, seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, meaning an original small number of birds in this group of islands, one species had been taken and modified for different ends. It was almost as if, call me crazy here, we'd started with one species of finch in the Galapagos, and maybe it, I don't know, it could have gotten blown there from South America in a storm or something like that. You know, we don't know, it doesn't really matter. But somehow a few bird species got to the Galapagos, and one of them changed over time into the Galapagos finch species that we see today, into species as different from each other as the woodpecker finch, which feeds on insects in rotten wood and bark and probes for them by picking up sticks. It's one of the few tool-using animals. It's a tool-using bird. Or my personal favorite on the right, the vampire finch, with a very sharp beak that feeds by hopping around where seabirds are nesting and pecking them in the butt and drinking the drops of blood. It's a blood-feeding finch. What the heck is that doing there? Although it may be not so strange, I mean, that an organism would, hop around and, peck other birds in the butts and drink their blood. I used to work for a guy that did something very similar. He was actually a former dean here, and he had a similar means of, stabbing people in the back and lapping up their blood. But he's not here anymore. Anyway, so the Galapagos stays, Darwin leaves, pondering why the Galapagos had so many species that were similar to mainland species, yet at the same time different enough to be called different species and adapted for different lifestyles. And the beagle crossed to Australia, crossed the Indian Ocean, rounded the Cape of Good Hope, rounded South Africa, stopped off there for a bit, crossed the Atlantic again, stopped in Brazil one more time, and got back to merry old England on October 2nd, 1830, Darwin stayed in London for a while and then moved out to what was the country, although now it's a suburb, living in this house, Down House, which is now a museum you can visit if you ever happen to be in London. He had plenty of work to do, but he found some time to think about this weird possibility that just maybe, call me crazy here, what would explain everything that he'd seen was that biological species weren't fixed, that they were capable of changing over time, over many generations, not over one lifespan. I mean, we all change over our lifespan, turning from, screaming babies to bratty toddlers to fine, upstanding young college students, to mature adults, to geezers, and we get wrinkly and gray and things like that. But I'm not talking about that change. I'm talking about change in physical features, not over one generation, but over many, over maybe thousands of generations. If that were true, and it's a heck of a hypothesis, but if it were true, it would seem to explain a lot of things that Darwin had seen. And not just Darwin, many other scientists as well. Darwin did not come up with this stuff on his own. We know a lot about what he was thinking because something like 35,000 letters written to or from him have survived. There's actually volumes of them, of printed volumes of his correspondence in the UCA library, if you ever really want to look. We know a lot about what he was thinking, and he was constantly communicating with all kinds of people. And he had this idea that change over time would explain things that not just he'd noticed, but a lot of other people had noticed. So first of all, there's the question, why should islands like the Galapagos, which, as I've said, are relatively young, they're these volcanoes that only relatively recently poked out of the sea, why should they have so many species that are found only in the Galapagos, but at the same time similar to the mainland? Why are there Galapagos penguins that are similar to South American penguins and yet not identical? Why should there be Galapagos hawks that are similar to mainland American hawks and yet not the same? Why should there be finches in the Galapagos that look like grassquits but aren't quite? Okay, maybe, Darwin thought, it's because all of those Galapagos species come from ancestors that lived on South America, got to the Galapagos somehow, and then changed over time, over many generations of living in the Galapagos. Okay, maybe. Interesting thought. But look at this. In the middle, that's the bones of a human hand. You could take the bones in your hand, the bones of a bat wing shown on the left, the bones of a seal flipper shown on the right, and you could match those up bone for bone. Your hand and a seal flipper and a bat wing have the same number of bones. They're arranged in the same pattern. The only real difference is length, and of course, some differences in the amount of skin and flesh between the fingers. Your fingers are free to move, whereas the bones supporting a seal flipper have, skin between them to make it a flipper. And of course, the bat wing has skin to make the wing surface. But other than that, the pattern's the same. You get the same pattern in the paw of a dog or a cat, excepting that some bones have gone missing. You get modifications of this pattern even in things like cow hooves. And that raises the question, why? Bat wings, seal flippers, and your hands do very different things. Why should structures that are that different be built using the same fundamental arrangement of parts? Why are they got the same pattern of bones? Well, maybe, says our hero, it's because if we could go far enough back in time, bats and seals and a lot of other critters had an ancestor that wasn't like any of those three, but it had that pattern. And each line of descendants from that ancestor has taken that pattern and modified it in a different way. But that pattern has still been inherited from a common ancestor, kind of like the ugly piano lamp that my mother has that used to belong to my great-great-grandmother. That patterns of building hands have been inherited over many generations, modified, shaped, adapted, but not never lost. Possibility, maybe. Some other folks that were working at the time, including a guy named Louis Agassiz and a guy named Carl von Baer in Germany, had started looking at embryos at the earliest developing stages of animals, still in the egg or maybe still in the uterus. And they'd already pointed out that the embryos of some species looked very much alike, even if the adults were completely different. Turtles and chickens don't look anything like each other as adults. You know, certainly it's very easy to tell them apart. And yet, if you crack open fertile turtle eggs and fertile chicken eggs in an early enough stage, you can hardly tell their embryos apart. They look almost identical. Why? Why should turtles and chickens, which look so different as adults, come from stages in the egg that are so similar you can hardly tell them apart? Why? Why should there be that similarity between the earliest developmental stages of turtles, chickens, even mammals? You went through a stage where you didn't look exactly like these things here, but you had a lot of points in common with those top diagrams of turtle and chicken embryos when you were about the size of a maybe a BB. Why should those similarities exist? Maybe they are, oh, good question on the chat. Maybe that's a sign of common ancestry. Okay, so the question is, so we were once all the same as a bat and a seal, but our environment changed us over time. Well, you personally were never a bat or a seal. If we go back far enough in time, the idea is that there was some critter, some mammal that was not a bat or a seal or a human, but it was the common ancestor of all three. And it had that pattern of bones in its legs or hands or whatever it had at the end of its arms. And all three lines of descendants of that ancestor have modified that pattern in different ways. So it's all about looking for signs of common ancestry. And that common ancestor would not have been a bat or a seal or a person or anything else that you'd recognize, but it had this pattern that's been modified in different ways by different lineages of its descendants. Okay, hopefully that'll clear things up for now. Okay, and then there's the question of why do fossils show change over time? We already know Earth's got a long history. Nobody at the time really knew how long, but it's awfully long. And Darwin had already noticed that there were some fossils that he found in South America that blended the features of what we now consider separate biological groups. This is one that was discovered just after he published his big book on the subject This was found in a quarry in South Germany. It's called Archaeopteryx lithographica. And most fossils do not look nearly this good, but in this particular quarry, living things got buried very rapidly, but under very calm conditions, and they preserve much more detail than your average fossil does. So this is a fossil that preserves exquisite detail of what these dead critters looked like. And judging just by the bones, this thing looks like a small dinosaur. It's basically a small raptor. I know you guys know raptors. You've all seen Jurassic Park. It's got, you can't really see them clearly in this picture, but it's got teeth that look like raptor teeth. It's got a long bony tail. It's got claws that look like raptor claws, including that reversed claw on the hind legs that one of the raptors taps on the floor ominously in the climactic scene of Jurassic Park, the first movie. Everything about this thing is screaming it's a dinosaur, except it is so well preserved that we can actually see impressions of what was covering the body. And this thing was covered in feathers. There's two very feathery wings, one up here and one over here. And there's a long feathery tail coming down like that. The best estimate that we can, obviously this is extinct. We can't watch it now, but as far as we can model it, it probably was capable of powered flight. It may not have been really good at it, but it could probably, get itself up into the air and bring itself back down safely. So is it dinosaur or is it bird? We used to think that dinosaurs were basically a type of reptile. But here we have this thing that has dinosaurian features and it's got bird features. And yes, we now think birds are descended from a common ancestor that was a dinosaur. This is a sizable chunk of the evidence for that. But for right now, just note that it blends features that you'd find in dinosaurs that didn't fly with birds that definitely do fly. So where did this thing come from? How do we explain that? Last thing, we can look at what are called vestigial structures. And this is my favorite example. If you've ever watched a dog or a cat, you've seen that they are capable of moving their ears. Dogs will prick up their ears, cats will swivel their ears around, or they'll move their ears back just before they bite you, like mine do to me all the time. Cows and horses will flick their ears to get rid of flies, and they can do this because they've got muscles that move their ears. You have the same muscles that dogs and cats and horses do. You've got 3 auricularis muscles that move your ears. Most people never learn how to use them. Most people cannot use those muscles and can't wiggle their ears. If we were meeting in person, I might ask. There's usually in a class this size, at least 1 or 2 people who have figured out how to use those muscles and they can wiggle their ears. But I ask every time, ear wiggling does not make any difference to human survival. I've never met anybody who was saved from death by that person's ability to wiggle their ears. I've never met anybody who had an opportunity to have babies just because of their incredible skill at wiggling their ears. Ear wiggling doesn't seem to make any difference to your life. So what are those muscles doing there? Why do you have them? Maybe they're signs of common ancestry. You're descended from a common ancestor that was an ancestor to all these other mammals. That common ancestor had ear wiggling muscles. You're descended from that ancestor. You've lost the need to wiggle your ears. but you've still kept those muscles. Again, kind of like a worthless antique that you can't use, but haven't bothered to get rid of yet. Like my great grandmother's piano lamp that my mother insists on keeping, even though it looks really weird. So maybe, call me crazy here, that's another sign that living things have come to look the way that they do because they've changed over time, and they share the features that they share because they are descended from common ancestors. And Darwin put all of this together by about 1840. And as he wrote, I am almost convinced that species are not immutable. Species are not unchanging. He spent the next 15 years gathering evidence for that idea and then put it out in a book called On the Origin of Species in the year 1859. And one of the things that that book did was put more evidence in one place than anyone had done before, that life on Earth had changed over time. But it also proposed a mechanism for what might cause life on Earth to change over time. What might be the driving force that is making descendants look different from their ancestors? And we will have to cover that on Friday, but it is just about time to be done here. So for today, I am going to stop the recording right now.